Well, everyone, I'm very happy to welcome you to this program that's being produced by the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford University. I'm Richard Dasher. I'm the director of the center, and we're very happy to welcome Dr. Amit Kapoor to give us a presentation on the topic of when economic development challenges democracy. Before introducing Dr. Kapoor a little bit more formally, I want to say a special welcome to representatives of the member companies of the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. We are a industry affiliate program at Stanford, and right now we have 21 member companies, and I do recognize names from a number of our companies. And we're also very happy to welcome the public. It's been a long tradition of ours at the U.S. Asia Center to have these kinds of programs to bring industry to Stanford. And now that we all have to do this online, I'm very happy that we can continue to do this, seeing each other as little boxes on the screen. We're going to have the session run for 1 hour. But if there are people who would like to stay afterward, after the hour, we can probably keep this going informally after the hour is up. So we will be turning off the recording. Right now, the session is being recorded, and we do plan to post it on our website, asia.stanford.edu. So today, I'm extremely happy to introduce one of our visiting scholars at the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford. Dr. Amit Kapoor is honorary chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness, India. He's also the president and CEO of the India Council on Competitiveness. He sits on the boards of competitiveness initiatives in Mexico, the Netherlands, Italy, and France. Amit is also affiliate faculty for the Institute of Strategy and Competitiveness at the Harvard Business School. He has been inducted into the Competitiveness Hall of Fame. He is widely sought after as a speaker on issues such as strategy, outsourcing, and economic development. He holds a PhD in industrial economics and business strategy, and he's received the Ruth Greene Memorial Award for writing the best case of the year by the North American Case Research Association. He's the author of the India City Competitiveness Report, the India State Competitiveness Report, and India Manufacturing Competitiveness Report, among other things. He is the author of several books on India, the India economy, such as Riding the Tiger. And today he's going to talk to us specifically about a volume that was sponsored by the Bertelsmann Foundation. We're very happy to say that this book is available for free download on the Bertelsmann website. And maybe that's a good point for me to turn the podium over to Amit. Amit, let me give you the floor.
Richard, thanks a lot for the time to talk about my new body of work. I have to thank one of my very special friends, Anthony Silberfeld, who's also there in the meeting, who's the co-author for this work, without whom this couldn't have actually happened, because it was a very interesting side conversation that we actually had in Italy, if I'm not wrong, or post-Italy conversation where we met, and then this book came into being. So Anthony, thanks a lot for being such a great support and a great friend during this whole exercise. So just talking about this, if you really look at the situation that we are seeing in the world, and the challenges that we are seeing in the world today, in terms of like how democracies are changing or how democracies are faring, there seems to be a reason that we need to build up an understanding as to why things are happening the way they are actually happening. What is the historical reason for it? What has driven this change that we are seeing? And there are countries after countries which are going through these sets of changes. In fact, top of the heap, I would rather say it as the United States, which is going through a lot of change in terms of the democratic processes and so on and so forth. And what is it that is causing these challenges. If you talk about US, if you talk about the situation like Brexit, or if you really talk about things that are happening in Brazil, or if you really talk about countries like Turkey, Italy, and so on and so forth. So what has driven that change? We need to understand this, and it becomes very important for us to understand, because from my point of view, understand it, and if we don't really stop a lot of things that we are facing today, we could actually end up into a very interesting situation like an authoritarian regimes across the world, and we need to understand these sets of situations. So if you really look at it, like any kind of transition, like democracies also go through a certain level of transitions. I would rather say that there are different phases and democracies that we would have actually seen. So the phase of democracy, I think it was 1828 and beyond until about 1920. So the 100-year period was the phase one of democracy, when it was just getting into inception. You had people like, so you had United States getting into creation of a democracy. People or adults actually got rights to vote. But it was after that, from 1920s, there was a certain bit of a transition, or there was a retreat in the whole democratic process. And this was the moment when authoritarianism was actually rising. So there was, of course, the Spanish flu that happened in the 1920s, very similar kind of a situation that we are facing today. And then, of course, the retreat of democracy started happening. And it did last for a period of about 2.5 decades. It was until the end of the World War that we actually saw the end of that phase of that authoritarianism regime, the rise of Hitler, and so on and so forth. So if you really look at it, phase two was again a very good period in terms of the uptick in the level of democracies. Again, there was some kind of a slump that happened in the 1960s with certain Latin American companies seeing coups and so on and so forth. But it was post 1974, which I feel has been one of the most interesting times for democracy. That is where the more and more countries have actually become democratic. Today, if you really look at it, more than 100 countries became democratic by the year 2000. But a country which is supposed to be the epitome of democracy is going through a certain level of challenges from my point of view. And what are those sets of challenges? But having said that, we are within the democracies and things, so in terms of, say, authoritarianism regimes and things. And why is it that actually happening? So I'll share some ideas I'll do a very quick snapshot. So I'll run through a lot of ideas very quickly, but we can actually come back to them as we are really doing the conversation. But then, if you really to start with Brexit was one of the most interesting periods that actually was happening. And why did Brexit happen? What was the reason for it? Of course, there is one very big thing in terms of saying that the empire did not find its feet again when it actually lost. There was this whole idea of the lost glory that Britain was not really getting used to. But having said that, there's something very interesting that happened. Like from a Brexit point of view, there are two time phases that we can actually see, the 1970 and the 2016 thing. So in the 1975 period, 68%. So if you really look at it, like the UK wanted to be part of the Greater Alliance, what you would call as part of the European Union. But it was 2016 when people just said that they don't want to actually be part of it. And suddenly this whole huge shift was absolutely startling, because the same set of people who had probably said that they want to be part of the European Union were the set of people who had become disenchanted in the 40-year period. So what was causing that change? So was it that you were really talking about things like economics, which was causing that change, or was it globalization which was causing this, or was it immigration that was actually causing it? If you really look at it, like there was this change of heart that was actually happening. So, and if I really see the four constituent parts of the UK, so 22.5 additional percentage more people wanted to actually leave the European Union. So what we were seeing is that there was this whole huge economic reason why people were wanting to actually exit the European Union as a concept. And the thing was that there was this whole huge disparity that was actually rising. So if you really talk about England, the only area wherein people wanted to be part of European Union was London In rest of the places, they really wanted to actually move out because they were feeling that they're being left out. And that left out feeling was in terms of they're not getting jobs. There was no income increase that was actually happening. So if you really look at it, this becomes fairly accentuated by understanding as to how the income ratios of the richest and the poor was actually changing. What we have seen is that there is a huge level of accumulation of wealth at the top, and this is true for across the world. In fact, there were a few set of numbers, if you really look at, I just wanted to share. When you about a country like, so the top 1% controls close to about 30, 21, 22% of the income. And that's a similar kind of a story we would find in the United Kingdom as well. So there was this level of disenchantment. But there's something very interesting that was actually happening. One is, of course, income levels, but what was driving as to why people were not wanting to be part of this concept of a globalized world and so on and so forth. But then this is about the correlation between education attainment and Euroscepticism. So people who were less educated, who did, when I say less educated, like not as a demeaning thing, it is a question of people who did not have college degrees. People have and getting so going through the right education process, they were actually feeling left behind as you were really looking at it. If you really look at what you call the income disparity as well, there was something like in terms of burning a hole in your pocket, as you could say, the real incomes, if you really look at it, they've not really increased on a weekly basis. In fact, in the 40-year period, you've just moved from what I call median weekly disposable income per person from 100 pounds to 205 pounds. That means this is a very minor increase that has actually happened. So there is this thing, like you could see that the rich are really becoming far richer, but it is actually at the median levels where people are actually getting disenchanted, or they're not really getting the share in the pie. In fact, a very interesting number here is that across the world, the productivity has risen close to about by 90% in the last, the gains have been immense, but the difference between productivity gains and wage rate changes is about 90%. So that means like there is this very vast yawning gap that is actually happening in terms of productivity increase and wage increases. So that is where it is. And then of course, if you really look at the European Union, it was in terms of saying, the countries which were doing better. In the 1970s, it made a lot of sense for Britain to actually be part of the Union because they were not growing at all at that point in time. They were actually seen as there was a fairly derogatory thing that was used for Britain at that point in time, the fallen economic power and all those kind of things. But then at this stage, what has happened is that Great Britain or they have, or UK has, this larger economic impact, and a lot of people feel that they can actually do one-on-one conversations with large economies, so on and so forth. But then, of course, as I said, correlation between income and Euroscepticism. So people who were actually earning less, they wanted to leave and things because they felt that they were actually getting exploited. And then this was also driven by a very interesting thing in terms of, say, migration. And when you're talking about, say, migration in terms of people coming from outside, there was this whole huge feeling that their jobs are being taken. And people started feeling that this is something absolutely wrong and whatever. So I think what we did see was that there is a certain level of, I would rather say, animalistic instinct that did drive in terms of how things are. And then, of course, there was this rise of the internet. And then because of the rise of the internet, there was a huge change in the way conversations were actually happening in terms of how political conversations were actually happening. Everybody was getting online, and there were these issues or larger issues of access to information and then how information was actually being shown. So there was this larger issue of what you would actually call as fake news and so on and so forth that has actually emerged. I'll share some bits here, but if you really look at it, the whole conversation on Twitter was something very interesting. The leave conversation, if you really look at it, like 50% of the conversation on Twitter was actually about 54% was to leave. So that the predominance of conversation on what I call Twitter actually ended up being that. And that's a true story that is actually happening across democracies right now, that the political people or political parties have learned how to use information on Twitter. And because that can actually create a larger impact. And this is also driven by something very interesting, and that is that, and I think it's a fairly brash statement to make, but I am convinced in my mind that in the world of the internet has also made us a little dumber. Because, and when I say that it has made us a little dumber is in terms of like how people are reading, how they're consuming information. So what is happening today is that people predominantly are not reading the long essay or the long word. So that whole thinking process is not happening. If you're limiting your understanding to 240 characters or 120 characters or 140, it is not really going to give me that insight. So there is this very strong thing in terms of saying, if I'm reading, if I'm learning, there is something on memory, it gives me some bit of better understanding, analytical skills, and those set of things seem to be falling. But again, if you might actually say, there is a very counterintuitive that people who fall for fake news are not a younger lot. It is actually the older lot. So people over the age of 60 fall for fake news far more easily than people who are actually under, who are 15 or 16. So there is a counterintuitive thing. So is it telling me that people who are beyond the age of 55, 60 are spending more time on the internet and they are actually stopping their habit of reading, consuming information, questioning, and so on and so forth? Or probably they are more enchanted by the idea of the past or the glorious past that can actually look at. So every country, for that matter, who's going through this democratic challenge, is a country which is seemingly looking at 2 or 3 distinct principles. One of them is make the country great again. So there is this whole hypothetical idea of a country which is great, and I do not know what does that greatness mean. In fact, somebody who asks like making America great again, the question that begs to be asked is that America is a very young nation. It is just a 300-year-old nation if you really look at it, which has had this tremendous level of impact and success as a country, as a society, but it's fairly young. So your greatness is happening now. You're emerging now. And last say, and then suddenly, how do you actually make it great? If you really talk about a place like India, making India great again would actually be a very oddball concept for a simple reason. Yes, okay, this is an ancient civilization. There was something that was actually happening, but we have to talk about the present. I think we have to leave this whole idea of being embedded in the past. The second thing that actually drives it is this whole idea of immigration. And when you say immigration, people and immigrations, there's a whole huge religious undertone to the idea of immigration. We like it or we don't like it, it is for real. I think we have to understand that people are, there is this whole thing of phobia on a certain set of people, certain set of castes, or certain set of religions, which need to be understood far deeper and better. But there is this idea of immigration, and with a certain sect, it could actually be a problem. And the third idea that all these people or leaders are really talking about are strengthening the borders. But these are the conversations, and you can see across the board, across countries, that a similar kind of a view is being followed. But then having said that, so this is when I was talking about income disparity. So there is this whole huge growing income disparity between rich and poor UK regions. So what you can actually see is that there is this gross, what I call the difference is rising in the graph, as you would actually see. And coming to India very quickly, and I want to talk about India. India has all country.
So we seem to be frozen for a minute.
One of the most successful democracies in the last 70 odd years since its actually existence. So what creates India as a democratic country actually gives it this whole what I call beauty of sustenance, because the level of excuse me, the level of differences, or what you would actually call as like India being one of the most interesting melting pots of the world. India changes every 100 kilometers, either say language or food or the basic cultural ideas or whatever. It can change every 100 odd kilometers. That what keeps this country together. In fact, what keeps this country together is also the reason for its resilience of being a democratic country. In fact, quite interestingly, of course, one of the largest democracies, the languages are there. Of course, there is a societal hierarchy. There are those challenges that actually exist, but possibly, and then the whole religious mix. But like there is this very interesting debate that I keep on hearing, and which is that is India a democratic country or not? Is it becoming very right wing, or is it something like it is not right for minorities? I somehow believe that this is a very oddball conversation. It gets skewed at a certain point in time. Because the question that begs to be answered here is that if India was the Hindus, which are the predominant set of people out here, they want this country to be democratic. They want this country to be secular. That is why this country is secular. If they never wanted this country to be, it would have changed in the last 70 odd years or 80 odd years. So it is not that we are simply saying that we don't want to be secular or whatever. So there is that criticism, but I somehow disagree with it. So India continues, that religious mix has very little bearing, that whole thought in terms of like letting people in and assimilation is, there might be some skirmishes that we see off to really move forward into that direction. But as you see, what we have seen is the rise of BJP. And now this is where the question that arises is that if we say that the rise of BJP has happened in the last 30 odd years, or what you would call as a right-wing Hindu nationalistic party, what is the reason for the rise of the BJP? This is where we have to actually understand or go deeper in terms of what happened in the 1980s in India. And this is where I feel that, of course, there are those two schools of thought in terms of, say, liberal and conservatives, and across the world, you would always see those sets of things. But in the Indian context, or even in the US context, or anywhere, the principle will remain very important for us to be seen. And the thing is, where did liberals go wrong? This is a question that we need to answer. If we don't really answer this, we will be and I think is not because either people and the whole idea of liberals was that they became so if you become aware, things will start going on. And so in Indian context, what we see is there was this very interesting judgment in the 1980s, the Shah Bano judgment, wherein the Uniform Civil Code was effectively going to get implemented, and that the Congress party said, oh, this is not going to be the right thing to do. They changed it. But that effectively sowed the seeds for the rise of the BJP. So liberals have just not understood that how people think or how things have to really change. So they need to be far more open to accepting rather than saying there is just one way. And they also have to become, they can't be tolerant to intolerance. They've just become so tolerant to intolerance that you've actually got things wrong. I think this is where we will also have to, as people, leave our animalistic instinct. I think what has happened is we have codified our societies in such a way that we follow the wolf kingdom in the best possible way. So we need to find a way. Hello?
Yes.
Am I audible, Kimberly?
You're audible. Once in a while, things are breaking up and your voice is a little bit distorted, but basically it's still coming through. So I think things are okay.
Oh, okay.
Let me suggest that you just go back exactly to the point you had stopped at and maybe speak kind of a little bit slowly and we'll keep going.
Okay, perfect. So if you really look at So I just
So Amit, you're frozen. Am I frozen?
No, we can hear you, Dr. Dasher.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the things that you have to deal with that I'm not sure we have a real good workaround at this point. When Amit comes back,
Yeah.
I'm going to engage him in some discussion. Amit, welcome back. Are you there?
His audio is not connected at the moment. I think
Okay,
he
he's
may be
turning
trying to
on.
fix that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We will keep this going one way or another. It's very interesting to see that at the earlier stages of economic development, it looks like the rising tide is lifting all boats. But at the later stages, both in the UK about anti-immigration and inside India, with this kind of, rise of the BJP, you have people looking for some group to blame for the unequal improvement in the economy, unequal distribution of wealth.
Dr. Kapoor, are you back?
yes, I am.
So maybe that having just made about 10 seconds of comments on what you said, I think we can start right back where you were. We'll come back to this as we get into the Q&A session.
You can also turn off your video when you're sharing your slides. That might help with your connection.
I'll just do that. I think. And are you able to see my slides right now?
You haven't started sharing yet. Here we go.
So, what to ask about is in terms of this issue of dynasties and everything that has created a lot of disenchantment in the minds of people. But there's something very interesting that we need to understand is in terms of the income disparity bit as well. So if you really look at the GDP growth rates for India, this is what becomes important here. But now the question is, a lot of people will tend to believe that when you actually have better growth rates that we are seeing in the world, then the incumbent parties will actually come back. But then this whole economic theory of voting somehow does not hold true in India. What we have seen is there was this one period in the 2000s, 2000 to 2010, when economic development was the driver for the incumbent party to come back, but it is rather social issues which actually brings the incumbent back. So when I say there are those two sets of objectives that we need to look at, and one is that economic objectives and social objectives. So economic objectives are there, but then social objectives have to be fulfilled far better for parties to actually come back. So that is what is being driven here. In fact, a lot of people, if you really look at it, governments, the political parties across the board are now talking about social objectives as the idea rather than economic thing to really move forward and talk about what I call winning elections and so on and so forth. But very quickly, I would like to move to the US idea, and then we close the what I call my part. I think, of course, there is this very, very interesting issue in terms of like how US actually functions and how the whole electoral college functions. So there are deep flaws that actually exist within that system, and there are those deep differences in terms of popular vote, not really defining as to who wins the election. So that flaw will have to really get rectified. Right? The system as it exists, whether we've exploited or not. But the larger question that arises here is what I would call authoritarian leadership or rise of very interesting things that are happening within the US. And I think what the danger today for the US is the moral high ground that actually US has is seemingly lost. US has probably lost its moral high ground in the last 4 years. If you actually have the same regime come back, I think the decimation of the US reputation so complete that it'll take ages for you to actually come back. And I'm sorry for saying that. I hope people understand that it is an important era that you have to really look at. But then who were the people who were actually voting for Trump? So what you would notice is that it was people who were beyond the age of 65, who were far more enchanted with Donald Trump. And that's a similar thing. And there are people who make between $50,000 to $100,000 are the people who are more enchanted with Donald Trump. As a family. So when I'm saying 50,000 to 100,000 as a family, they get more enchanted with Trump. And then, of course, the older people, when I say old, that means people beyond the age of 60 are more towards that whole idea of make America great again and so on and so forth. But there is also this very interesting dark side of capitalism, or the disparity, which is causing a lot of anxiety. And because of the COVID also, we have seen that this is becoming a very important conversation. So the richest 5%, the income gains for them have actually been just stunning over a period of time and things, and the disparity has been rising. So how do we really get this right? So this also begs us to ask a question: how will the whole capitalistic system change? In fact, the whole globalized world, what was being seen is that people started feeling that, oh, they are getting exploited, their jobs are going outside. But rather than seeing it from a perspective that it is education which was actually creating a lot of turmoil. So a lot of people have not understood that education has played a very important role. Universities plays an exceedingly important role, and people need to continue to get educated in things. So if you really look at it, so if you income gains after the 1980s, what you would see here is 1% seeing tremendous gains to the rate of about 200% odd. And if you really talk about gains for the middle 60%, it is like just 47%. So what we are seeing is that rising disparity that happens. But this is something very interesting. And again, an economic view. So make America great again was an idea, but then this was actually about employment versus unemployment kind of a thing. So wherever unemployment was rising in 2015, that is where Trump was actually winning. So if you really look at it, so there is this whole exploiting of the journey. That is where people were feeling disenchanted. So out of the 3,007 counties which US has, 2,400 were effectively not reaping in the benefits of the globalization or whatever. And that is where people were feeling disenchanted and they actually wanted to exit, or they just wanted to actually not exit, and they wanted to be having a different savior of them. So somebody is going to come and really help and move things forward. So that is what was actually happening. But if you really look at it, like US is again a very interesting story in terms of like how news actually happens. So if you really look at it, all eyes on cable, so Fox News, look at the number of users for Fox News to CNN. So there seems to be very, very interesting situation in terms of what is happening. So the political theater has moved online, and then people are really, and this is what the thing is, 84 million. In fact, this was the last time when I looked at it, but there are far more now. For Donald Trump in terms of the number of people. So 11% of people over the age of 65 shared fake news on the internet. And then, of course, 52% of them actually voted for Trump. So there is this very interesting thing that was actually happening in terms of age, education, economics, sharing of news, believing in a certain set of things, and so on and so forth. So these, but then of course, there are challenges we are seeing within the US in terms of what do you call democracies and everything. So there is this, now, according to the Democracy Index, US is being slated or being said to be something like a flawed democracy. And we need to really get those things right as well. Things. Point. Of course, economics plays a very important role. It is about inequality. It is inequality of wealth. It is also about access to opportunities. And then, of course, there could be the whole idea of, when I say inequality, would also mean race, religion, caste, and so on and so forth. The second thing is that there is a social argument as to why this is happening. So education is exceedingly important, and we have to find a way that people do get educated, because otherwise there seems to be a certain level of what I call darkness that can actually prevail. And then, of course, identity. Identity also plays a very important role. But whenever there is what I call economic disparity that rises, people go towards identity much more strongly than any other point in time, because there is no other peg that people feel that they have to actually sustain or be on. So they either will take about, say, social identities, religious identities, or whatever. That is what you would actually move towards. But last but not the least, we need to break this cycle of being tolerant to intolerance, and then things will change. So these were a few ideas, Richard, that I shared, but I think I've taken more time than I to you.
So, Amit, I'm not sure. Do you want to take a few minutes and talk about Brazil? It's right there. Hello?
I think if you can give me 3 or 4 minutes, I can talk about Brazil as well.
Okay.
Okay. So with your permission. So very interestingly, Brazil is also something very interesting. But then one point on Brazil is also the resentment of the rich in Brazil, which caused this. So at the end of the day, it is all about incomes and everything that is happening. But there's one more, and Brazil was a country like which has been at the helm of really moving things in Latin America, in terms of like being at the top of the heap in terms of really accepting newer sets of ideas and things. But then there's something very interesting which I thought I should share, and the long ride to equality. Brazil is far more equal than a lot of many other countries in the world, but this is where disenchantment started. So if you really look at people who voted for Bolsonaro, so before I go to Bolsonaro, but this is where you need to actually look at the bottom 50%, they have actually seen their fortunes rise. The top 10% saw their fortunes rise, but the middle class was actually getting sucked. In Brazil has not really had those gains that they could have actually. A whole set of schemes that were actually happening. The Bolsa Familia in Brazil, wherein the bottom rung people were actually being given doles or support or whatever. So if you really look at 2016 figure, so there were about 114 million families, which actually got close to about $14.1 billion in support or income, what I call direct payments through support from the government. So that translates to about $1,000 per family that actually did go there. But what happened is that this increased the pace of growth of the poor and slowed the pace of the middle class, and middle class got disenchanted by the whole. You need to actually have a person who is far more reasonable to the rich or whatever. So I would actually say it was a process wherein the middle class was feeling that their maids are making more money. In fact, there's a very interesting article that appeared in FT, if I remember correctly, that maids are making more money than the families that they're working for. And that suddenly caused a lot of flutter into the system. So if you really look at it, of course, the income share of the top 1% is 30% of the income. But at the end of the day, if you really look at it, it's the rich people who did vote for Bolsonaro, or the rich regions which actually voted for Bolsonaro in Brazil. And Haddad, it was actually the poorer regions which actually voted for him. So this is actually what you call as the revolt of the rich, or revolt of the middle class, when they actually felt they were paying taxes and the money was being given to the poor, and so on and so forth. So this is how the vote distribution actually happened. So richest 77% went for Bolsonaro, and then 22% of the poor were there. But then this is something very, very interesting, as you were actually seeing. But at the end of the day, again, those points: identity, economics, social, which actually becomes the underlying principle as we are seeing. So over to you, Richard, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Amit. This is really fascinating, really incredible compelling data points that you've shared. And for everybody here, I would like to say that Amit and I have had a number of very thought-provoking conversations over the last few months. I'm not sure where all of this is going to go, but I want to make one comment before we open it up to questions. The sort of common thread that I see in your 4 case studies are that economic growth it's impossible for it to happen monolithically, which means that it almost always increases some sort of inequality in the economy in which it happens. That, I think, is going to be borne out by the sort of 3 stages of economic development that the World Economic Forum has recognized: factor-driven growth, efficiency-driven growth, and then innovation-driven growth. And in these different stages, there tend to be different winners and losers. In the early stages, the winners kind of make everybody feel like the rising tide is lifting everybody's boat. You're all better off now than you were before economic development started. As you move on, though, what happens is some people are able to game the system. They're able to say that your share of this growth is not fair. And I think what people are after is not true equality. Most people are after a better situation for their children than they themselves have. And these people who game the system are able to tell them that there is some group of people who are preventing your children from having the possibility that they deserve. That can be against globalization. So the people who are made to take the fall are immigrants, or it can be against some group in the country. So in that case, you see the rise of the BJP in India. You also see the rise of the anti-elites. And I think that is very much reflected in the situation here in the United States, as well as in some of these other countries. And I'm curious, Amit, how do you see the possibility for preventing someone from gaming the system so that they come up with somebody to blame who is not really the problem? Can we all achieve in a democracy a level of understanding of economics that would allow democracy to persist? What do you think?
So, Richard, you did crack up in between.
I
So,
did.
if I heard you correctly, what you're saying is there a way? Yes. So, the question was that can we create a system in the economic system where democracies can persist? Was that the question?
That's right.
Definitely. I think, like as the learning goes, there are 2 sets, and I did allude to that point in between as well. And that is, of course, there are social objectives and economic objectives. Economic objective is that, of course, things will actually change. You will have income growth and things. But at the end of the day, there is something like, say, social progress, which is going to drive how people actually live. And it is, when I say social progress, it's about quality of life. So what matters to people at the end of the day is about quality of life. And if I'm able to deliver quality of life to people, then the disenchantment with democracy is actually reduces quite significantly. If you really look at the Indian system, so when in terms of, say, of course, income disparity doesn't happen in India. But at the end of the day, what the government has actually been able to do, there are 2 things. Like, one is that they were able to look at giving internet access, banking access, and so on and so forth, and even piped gas into the homes. And that suddenly changed the fortunes of the the government or the incumbent party, typically, and they actually came back with a bigger majority. So what we did see is that if you're able to improve the quality of life of people, then it does really move into a very interesting situation. But the important thing is, if you promise on this and if you don't deliver, then you will actually lose out.
So,
But if you
Amit,
promise and deliver, then
I want
suddenly
to
things start
challenge you a
changing.
minute. I want to challenge you because it may not be the actual quality of life, it's more of the perception of the quality of life. Think about it. Here, these days in China, which is, I think everyone would agree that it's an authoritarian approach to economic growth, people put up with it because they see no reasonable alternative to the improvement that the government tells them that they've received. Whereas the globalization that has really benefited both America and the UK is something that has benefited everybody, but people are able to game the system by pointing out that it's benefited some people a lot more than it's benefited you.
So, Richard, that's an important point, and especially when you talk about, say, China. I think China's system is hugely different from the way India or US is. At least in China, you can't protest. There is a simple way you can't protest. There are things like, at least in USA, you're able to protest. You're able to say that this is wrong. You're able to fight it out. I think that makes the country so resilient. Whatever anybody says, but I think the democracy or democratic process is always functioning on protest. So that does happen. So we are able to take it forward, and we are able to say that yes, things have to change. And it is not only about perception, it is also about reality. I think if you really look at it, in the US, the quality of life has actually significantly reduced over the last few years. And that is where the disenchantment has also happened. In fact, I was surprised. I was reading some paper that if you're living in the Bay Area, if you make less than $140,000 a year, you could actually be categorized as somebody who's below the income level is not appropriate. So that can be an obnoxious thing. So look at the rentals or whatever. You need to set that right. There has to be that whole semblance that has to be brought in. The capitalistic system cannot be a greedy system. It has to have far more realistic way of looking at things, and so on and so forth. So that is where we have to get it right. But then quality of life has degraded. I think I can always say, the first time when I came to the US was in 1989. And when I came to US in and of course, my last trip was in 2019 or 2020, post that the COVID happened. But 1989, there was something very interesting. I stayed with an American family as an exchange student, and they came to the aircraft door to drop me. And today, anybody who's actually dropping me at the airport has to just, that is a quality of life measure. So that our whole obsession, how things have changed, that suddenly changes. The America I know as a kid was something so different, so more inclusive, so more interesting, and it has changed. So that is a simple measure that has actually happened. In fact, there are a lot more other changes that are happening, and I always see that there is the last point, the underbelly of anger that remains in the US is very high. I do not know, it was a conversation that was actually happening about a year back, and I said, there is an anger which is there in the United States, which has come to the streets, and it exactly did happen in the last 6 months.
So thanks. I'd also like to thank Professor Hoda for making a really good comment in chat. He writes, fascinating. Going through all this data, it is not surprising that many developing countries are seeing China as the most successful country in the world, which is challenging our democracy, our freedom, our traditional way to increase welfare as a whole society, which is ultimately sustainability. I think that this really is a challenge. Again, it's a challenge of perception. In that regard, how do you see these kind of world problems like sustainability in the face of climate change or sustainability in the face of an industrial revolution, maybe changing the way that we need to approach economic growth?
So, Richard, this is an exceedingly important point that we have to understand. And that is about, first, I think the problem in the way things are right now is that a lot of us have become deniers of science. And so when suddenly you have a science denier who takes the top office, then suddenly it actually creates a lot of interesting situations. And that's not, and I'm not talking about US, I'm talking about Brazil as well, which is one of the head of the state is absolutely denier in science and things. But then I think they need to understand, people need to accept that science is real. You cannot actually believe in some bullshit of an idea which is embedded in thoughts and illogic and whatever. You have to actually just move into that right direction. If we don't challenge it, I think this is where education becomes important once again, that people need to get the right set of information to move in. But when the enchantment that is there with the Chinese model is very, very huge. The enchantment actually is there because, they're doing so well, they're actually growing rich, everything just functions, and so on and so forth, without realizing that there is severe curtailment of freedom that actually exists. In fact, people today who are actually feeling, I don't want to wear a mask, you are able would not have been able to do that. So free countries actually give you that thing, but then you can't be stupid to do things that are being there. So freedom is real. Freedom is something that you need to cherish, and you need to actually move into that direction and sustain it. If you lose it once, it is going to take years for you to come back. And it can take decades for you to actually come back and rev up to really be there.
So I know we have a very worldwide audience watching today, but specific for Silicon Valley, I think that the Valley has taken advantage of growth opportunities, economic growth, without really considering these kind of social sort of things that happen along the way. Do you have recommendations for the private sector, especially the sort of technology innovation drivers that we all try to be in Silicon Valley, in regard to the social side, the social impact of growth?
Oh, yes. I think, one, we have to create models. I don't think there is any problem in making money. So I think entrepreneurship should move into that direction. But the question is that there has to be far more equitable distribution of wealth in terms of salaries and so on and so forth. So I'll give you an example of Amazon, wherein the wealth accumulation that has happened for Jeff Bezos in the last few months after the COVID crisis his valuation has increased significantly. But the salaries for people within Amazon has not increased, and there was a demand. I think if he does that, that will be seen as a far more greater help to capitalism than anything else that can actually happen. We need to find a way to say that there has to be some realistic salaries that need to be given in the Bay Area people. So change your model, change what I would always call it the creative model, which is like creating a shared value model. In terms of like wherein you're trying to solve a societal problem, you do make money around it, and so on and so forth, but don't be exploitative of your people, and don't be exploitative of resources and things, and just create models around it, and which can be possible. So the Silicon Valley will have to move into that direction. Otherwise, I think a lot of people within the US will see, though Silicon Valley is just one of the areas where growth is happening, accumulation is happening, and whatever, and suddenly all rest of the United States has been left behind. So probably this is where the function of what you call as a CSR, the corporate social responsibility, becomes exceedingly important, and investment in those areas becomes exceedingly important. So today, there is also one more responsibility that the tech companies have to take, that it is technology which enables democracies, and it also can be the reason of fall of democracies. So how actually find that there has to be the right set of information that actually goes out? How do we educate people how to discern what is right, what is wrong? Because the very models of, say, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, they'll give you information that I actually want to see. They don't give you information which is, the algorithms work that way. So I can actually get embedded or deeply into a certain strain of thought. If I'm looking at a right-wing video, I'll go into that right-wing video and I'll continue to see those sets of things. So we need to change that. We need to be far more responsible in terms of how algorithms are built, how information is given, how wealth is disseminated, how economic models are created. But it is definitively there, because the question that arises today is on the efficacy of democracy and capitalism as a system. Because if we don't change, we would actually get into a...
Thank you, Amit. I'm curious, how do you see the Scandinavian models? Very much kind of I don't know if you should call them socialist democracies or socially driven democracies, but do you think that they offer a model for everybody? Could you hear me? Did I lose everybody? Are we frozen?
So you said
Oh, no, he's
The
there.
Scandinavian
I
democracies,
did lose
how do
you
you
for
see
a
them as a
bit,
possible
Richard.
model?
So the question is, how do I see Scandinavian countries as a possible model?
Yeah.
So, like Scandinavian model is a very interesting model, and I will bring something up here. In fact, there is something called the Atheism Index. I did not want to bring it up in the talk, but I would say it here. So if you, countries which have far better, what I call, people who believe less in God are far more richer, or whatever, they have far better income possibilities and things, or else the question is that people who start having income disparities, the belief in God becomes much higher in those set of locations, because that's a peg that you actually want to live on. But so Scandinavian countries once say that 97% of the people in Scandinavian countries do not believe in the idea of Godhead, or the big daddy or the sky daddy being there, and things. So what we can see is that the model is something very interesting. The salary difference between the bottom to the top is very, very limited. And then they are able to create that socialistic system which just functions. So that is a model that should work. It's a capitalistic socialist system that functions and delivers. And that is a model, if you are able to replicate, would just be a stunning example. But the question is, those are very small countries. So will it actually be able to function in large democracies, large countries, large.
Yeah, especially large, diverse countries, this becomes
Yeah.
a difficulty. Um, there's a very interesting comment from Ravichandra Tadigatapa, which is that in India, the BJP's vote seems to be driven by elites, whereas in the US and UK, income inequality is driving populism. And in Brazil, because redistribution in India has not been really radical enough to hurt the middle classes, is there an economic rationale for the rise of the BJP? Hello?
So, okay, now the
Yeah.
first point, yes, yeah, I did uh, read that question. So, information would be flawed, actually. And I'll give you the reason for that. Like BJP, with the vote percentage that they actually got this time over, could not have been that it was just the elites who were actually giving that vote. And then, of course, if you really look at the figures from 2014 to 2019, what did we see was that if I say like there was this increase of close to 38% in the number of people who voted from the lower caste, as India would put it, or what you would actually call as low scheduled caste. The lower caste increased by 15%. The peasant caste increased by about 16%. The upper caste just increased by about 14%. So the question is, it is not a party which is only for the elites. It has become a party which is far more comprehensive or far more inclusive than a lot of people would want to actually believe. So BJP's appeal is actually across the board at this point in time. In fact, so that is where it is. So it is not something which is like an upper caste or whatever. It's just not there. And then, of course, the other thing is what BJP has been able to do from a social point of view is that they've understood that social objectives need to be fulfilled, and that is what they have actually focused on. So the whole idea of Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, that is giving a bank account, creating access to mobile, or creating an identification card, direct benefit transfers to people, or whatever, that has actually enabled their rise and their absolute affinity what I call towards the poor. So what we've seen is like BJP at one point in time, what Ravi Chandra was saying is right if he was talking to me about 10 years back. BJP was a very strong urban party, but suddenly it has actually become a far more inclusive, and it is now getting more traction from the rural areas than the urban areas. So that is where it is. So it has created far more inclusive thing over a period of time. And then economic rationale, of course, like the economic rationale is very clear. Like people wanted to see the rise of economic, the rise of or increased development in India. So the model of Gujarat, in terms of saying that there is this model wherein things have worked, people have actually got incomes coming in. So that is what they would have actually wanted, and that's where there is a very clear model that BJP has seen. And I do hope that we are able to see a path where far greater incomes are possible. India sees a better growth rate. Of course, things are stalled because of COVID and this crisis. We might have actually been pushed back by a few years, if not a decade or so. But we might take years to rev back and come back to the status that we should have actually been had COVID not been there.
Amit, thank you for your answer. For everyone, I think that this is the end of the stated time of the talk. I'm going to stay online. I think, Amit, you're going to stay online for a little while to answer informal and have a little bit more informal discussion if we can. But I want to join, I think, everybody in thanking you for a really thought-provoking and wonderful presentation today. Let's call an end to the recording and continue informal discussion.